Mr. Chairman. This is Lee Serrano, Amendment Lee number 2.
An amendment offered by
Ask for the
Ms.
reading to be waived.
Considered done, and the gentlewoman's recognized.
This amendment that Mr. Serrano and myself have offered, it would prohibit ICE and CBP from engaging in immigration enforcement activities in sensitive locations, as well as courtrooms and departments of motor vehicles, unless, mind you, agents have an administrative warrant for a fugitive person named in the warrant. Our amendment would codify and expand already existing ICE and Customs and Border Control policy into statute. This language acknowledges current ICE policy, which states that enforcement at sensitive locations should be avoided unless, again, as I said, the exception is for a fugitive person named in a warrant. These are locations identified as schools, healthcare facilities, places of worship, religious or civil ceremonies or observances, and public demonstrations. So my amendment would merely strengthen this language and codify it. Under this current administration, ICE has created unwarranted fear in many of our communities, especially for immigrants. Families and entire communities are really scared to go out of their houses in fear of ICE picking them up and deporting them. ICE arrests individuals with no criminal convictions. These arrests have jumped 156% since January. This is completely unacceptable. Families shouldn't have to face leaving their homes in fear and just to go outside and to do normal activities. But that's what's currently taking place. For example, in Los Angeles, ICE recently picked up a father who was taking his 13-year-old daughter to school. Can you imagine taking your own child to school only to be picked up and interrogated? In Queens, New York, ICE went to an elementary school to inquire about a fourth grader. In El Paso, Texas, which incidentally, Mr. Chairman, that's my birthplace. I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas, if that helps any, Judge Carter. ICE officers also detained a domestic violence victim when she walked into a courtroom to get a protective order against her abuser. In my own district now, in the Bay Area, I've heard of my constituents who are deeply, deeply terrified. Children are afraid to go to school. Restaurant owners are training staff on what to do if ICE shows up. These are morally reprehensible actions, at sensitive locations like schools and bus stops, and that has a real negative impact on our communities. So I would hope that we could get a vote for this, and thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Chairman Carter.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. I rise in opposition to your amendment. This amendment is not only unnecessary, it's also, quite honestly, dangerous. It is unnecessary because ICE has an effective written policy in place that prohibits targeted operations, including arrests, interviews, searches, and surveillance at sensitive locations without prior approval from senior ICE leadership. Director Herman testified before my subcommittee that there have been 0 operations conducted without prior approval, and not one illegal alien has been arrested at a school or hospital. It is dangerous because the amendment expands this list to include colleges, bus stops, courthouses, scholastic-related activities without a definition, or events, which could be used to prevent ICE actions at a multiple of otherwise non-sensitive locations. This amendment would create safe havens for dangerous criminal aliens where they would be immune from enforcement of our nation's immigration laws. Large swaths of public space would essentially be off-limit from ICE enforcement. I strongly agree with the acting director's testimony that courthouses are not and should not be considered sensitive locations. Courthouses are secure environments where ICE can apprehend fugitive aliens while being mostly assured that they have no weapons on them in that moment. Why should we not want ICE to apprehend lawbreakers in a secure environment? ICE should not be prevented from arresting aliens encountered even in these sensitive locations when they enter to execute administrative warrants for a fugitive person. While this amendment would enable ICE to go in these locations with a warrant, it would force ICE to turn a blind eye to any other illegal alien encounter in that sensitive location. The amendment does nothing but hamstring law enforcement, endanger the public, and erode the security of our communities. Therefore, I oppose this amendment and ask a no vote against it.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Roybal Allard is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment. The draft committee report affirms the ICE policy of avoiding sensitive locations in the absence of compelling circumstances, and I should, at a minimum, continue to follow that policy. But it does need improvement. Consistent with Ms. Lee's amendment, it needs to incorporate courthouses as sensitive locations, and it needs to be codified in law. I understand ICE's rationale for taking custody of dangerous individuals at courthouses, where they can be more assured that such individuals will not be armed and therefore will not be a threat to ICE personnel. I appreciate the dangers that ICE officers and agents face every day, and I do not want to place them needlessly in danger. But we need to find a different way to ensure that ICE can safely apprehend dangerous people, one that does not have the effect of intimidating people from appearing at court as witnesses or victims of crime. It would help if ICE were more focused on dangerous individuals and avoided apprehending people who are not a threat, because I believe ICE would find more jurisdictions willing to work with them if they were more narrowly focused in that way. I urge my colleagues to support the Lee amendment.
Thank you, gentleman. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Serrano, is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment and thank Ms. Lee for allowing me to be part of it. I respect Judge Carter and I respect his words, and I mean that sincerely, and I heard his sincerity when he said what's going on. But that's not what we're hearing from our communities, and that's not what we're seeing. There are communities where pictures have been taken of ICE agents and ICE trucks in front of schools, in front of hospitals, in front of public benefit places, in front of churches. So what's written down as part of the policy is correct. What is being carried out is not always what's written down. And we need more than ever today to have a community that is not afraid of ICE agents unless they have something to fear. But what you're seeing now is you're seeing people, for instance, I'll give you something semi-unrelated, but related nevertheless. I saw a woman come to me and say, is it true that because I became a citizen in the last 5 years, I can be kicked out of public housing? I said, you became a citizen in the last 5 years, and you think you can get kicked out of public housing? Of course that's not true. But that's the kind of fear that's running through our communities. And when you have people from ICE seen at places that they're not supposed to be at, this only adds. So, Judge Carter, with all due respect, I think you shouldn't take only what you're told at the hearing, because if I take everything I've been told at hearings, you know, I wouldn't have anything to legislate on. But there is a lot going on that shouldn't be going on. And perhaps, rather than just accept it, you should delve into it, dig into it, and try to find out what really is happening. We can't have ICE bring fear to the hearts of people, because if it was only bringing fear to criminals, undocumented, you know, I wouldn't even stand up to speak. But they're bringing fear to citizens. They're bringing fear to people here legally with a green card, and they're bringing fear to undocumented that are minding their business. So we need to get into this as soon as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano. Ms. Meng is recognized. And then I'm going to go to Ms. Lee to close.
Thank you. I too rise in support of the Lee Serrano amendment. We have had many stories and seen many incidents where ICE agents are showing up at these sensitive locations. I have heard from major hospitals in and around my district that have reported marked sharp declines in emergency room visits since last November because immigrants are terrified of getting medical care. An undocumented population does not fully explain this phenomenon. We also need to improve protections for students at schools. As was mentioned, schools are considered a sensitive location. ICE agents have targeted students and their parents at schools, and many of our children are afraid to go to school. We also need to strengthen our definition of sensitive locations, reiterating our protection for schools and hospitals, and include an expansion of these protections to certain courthouses. The current definition of sensitive locations, as was mentioned, does not include courthouses, and it allowed ICE agents to enter a courtroom in search of a young woman just 2 weeks ago in my district. It was a courtroom that was designated as a human trafficking intervention courthouse. So I rise in support of this amendment.
The ranking member, Ms. Lowy, is recognized.
Thank you. Although most has been said, I really want to thank you, Ms. Lee, for this amendment, and I rise in strong support. I've heard from my constituents, adults, grandparents, no child should fear that just by going to school, he or she could be picked up by ICE and deported, and no mother should fear bringing her sick child to the hospital because ICE will be waiting for her in the emergency room, and no victim should fear testifying against their domestic abuser in court because ICE is stationed in the courthouse lobby. Mr. Chairman, there are certain sacred spaces in our society where children and families must be able to live free of paralyzing fear of deportation. So I want to thank you, Ms. Lee, and I urge my colleagues to vote for this.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. Ms. Lee, a minute to close.
Thank you. I want to thank all of my colleagues who have spoken on behalf of this amendment. And we'll close by mentioning a couple of things. First of all, my amendment does nothing to exempt agents from arresting a fugitive person anywhere as long as there is a warrant, and that's the way it should be. Secondly, and Judge Carter, I want to make sure that it's understood this, and given the debate today on all of our amendments, it seems like the issue had to do with authorizing language. Well, this is not authorizing language. This is an appropriate funding limitation which is germane to our committee. And so I thought maybe that might help you support us. So if it doesn't, okay. Just on its merits, I ask for an aye vote because people really should not have to live in fear. It's getting pretty desperate out there, and I know many of your districts and many of your constituents are feeling this also. So we should do the right thing and make sure that we protect, children and sensitive spaces from such terrible fear tactics.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. The questions on the gentlewoman's amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. In opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Sufficient number of hands.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Bishop. Aye. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright. Aye. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Mrs. Clark. Ms. Clark, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Clymer. Ms. Clymer, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy. Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum. Aye. Ms. McCollum, aye. Ms. Meng. Aye. Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Molinar. No. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, yes. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, yes. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, yes. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, yes. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roybal Allard. Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Rupesberger. Mr. Rupesberger, yes. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklowski. Mr. Visklowski, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no.
Are there members who wish to record their vote or change their votes? Dr. Harris. No.
Dr. Harris is recorded no.
Anyone further? Mr. Amadei.
Mr. Amadei recorded no.
Okay, then seeing no one else, the clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 22, the nays are 30. The amendment is not agreed to. Our last amendment